Welcome to my channel, Vibes of Life. In today's video, we're diving deep into a spiritual war most people don't even realize they're part of. This isn't a sermon. This isn't a lecture. This is a story that could change the way you see the battles around you and the ones within. It started with a whisper. That's all it took. One quiet, intrusive thought that crept into Thomas's mind just before dawn. He was an ordinary man, mid-30s, working in finance, living in the city, rarely giving much thought to spiritual warfare. He believed in God, sure, and he'd read some C.S. Lewis during college. The screw-tape letters had stuck with him, but it always felt like fiction. Clever, unsettling fiction, but nothing more. That is, until the whispers became voices. At first, Thomas thought he was just tired, maybe stressed. But something in his apartment began to shift. Lights flickering for no reason, the sudden cold in just one corner of the room, the heaviness in the air. He brushed it off. He wanted it to be explainable. But deep down, something told him he was wrong. That's when he remembered Lewis' most chilling idea, that the devil's greatest trick is convincing us he doesn't exist. What if those thoughts, those sharp, self-doubting inner jabs, weren't all his own? What if they were planted? He turned back to the screw-tape letters, flipping through the pages with a sense of urgency he hadn't felt in years. That's where he found it. Hidden between the lines, tucked inside the twisted advice of a senior demon to his apprentice, was a spiritual battle tactic so subtle, so powerful, that Thomas nearly dropped the book. Lewis had seen it. He had warned us. There are things demons hate. Specific, powerful things, not just prayer or holy words, but actions, small, consistent actions that disrupt their strategy. Thomas realized he had been feeding the wrong energy, giving power to the very thoughts trying to bring him down. What Lewis described wasn't just spiritual theory, it was warfare strategy, and Thomas was losing. That same night, something dark visited his dreams. A figure cloaked in shadow stood at the foot of his bed, not moving, not speaking, just watching. When Thomas woke, the room felt colder than ever. The air was thick with fear, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he was alone. He knew he had to act. But how? What exactly was it that demons hated? What was this secret Lewis had buried in fiction, hoping the right people would see it? The next day, Thomas did something ordinary, yet completely disruptive to the darkness around him. And that's when the real war began. But before we dive deeper into what he discovered, before we expose the exact thing demons hate most, you need to understand what was truly at stake, because once you see it, there's no unseeing it. And Thomas, well, let's just say, the battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. Thomas spent the entire morning in a daze, his coffee cold in his hands as his mind ran wild with questions. Was it all in his head, or had something truly crossed over into his space? He remembered Lewis writing that demons don't just attack violently, they work in the quiet corners of everyday life. They whisper in the boredom, poke during the silence, feed off of distraction. That's what made their tactics so effective. No thunder, no flashing lights, just slow, invisible erosion. He hadn't told anyone, not his co-workers, not his family. Who would believe him? Even he didn't fully believe himself yet. But deep down, he knew something had changed. He could feel it in the way he moved through his apartment. He could sense it in the unease that settled over him the moment he turned the lights off. Something was watching, waiting. But for what? That night, Thomas sat on the edge of his bed, flipping through the old Lewis book again. His fingers stopped at a section he barely remembered reading the first time. It talked about the importance of spiritual habits, tiny, consistent disciplines that pull a person back to truth, even when they can't feel it. Things like gratitude, humility and silence, especially silence. Lewis hinted that silence wasn't just peace, it was resistance, the kind demons hate most. But why silence? Thomas leaned back and thought about it. The world was loud. His phone never stopped buzzing. The news was non-stop. Music, podcasts, social media. It was all noise. And in all that noise, it was easy to lose your center, easy to forget who you are, easy to believe lies that weren't even yours. Maybe that was the real battle, not against fear or evil in some dramatic way, but against the tiny ways darkness tries to steal your focus. He remembered how Lewis had described spiritual warfare as a slow turning of the soul. Not always dramatic, not always obvious, just subtle. That's what made it so dangerous. And Thomas began to see that this fight wasn't just about one night of fear. It was a pattern. It had been happening for months. The fatigue, the disconnection, the sudden rise in self-doubt. It had crept in quietly. And now, with the presence in his apartment growing stronger, he realized the pattern wasn't random. It was targeted. Still, the question echoed in his head. What exactly was the act that demons hated so much? What secret had C.S. Lewis buried in these pages, hidden in plain sight, that could shift the balance of power? Thomas was close. He could feel it. But as he shut the book and turned out the light, he didn't realize something had already stepped into the room with him. The next morning, Thomas woke up feeling like he hadn't slept at all. There was a pressure in the air, something invisible but heavy, like the room itself was pushing down on him. The usual morning light through the blinds felt duller somehow, muted. He noticed his phone had shut off overnight. Strange. It had been fully charged. His laptop wouldn't turn on either. No messages, no emails. It was like the world had gone silent. That's when he remembered Lewis's warning. How evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just disconnects you. From people, from truth, from God. And once that isolation sets in, the rest becomes easier to control. Thomas felt it now, creeping in around the edges of his routine. At work, things weren't much better. His co-workers seemed distant. Conversations felt hollow. One of his closest friends, Jason, avoided eye contact. It was as if Thomas was slowly being erased from the rhythm of everyday life. And deep down, a thought whispered, "Maybe you're already too far gone." But Thomas knew that wasn't his voice. Back home, the silence returned, but this time it felt alive. Every time Thomas reached for his Bible or opened Lewis's book, something in the room would shift. The air would grow dense. Shadows stretched just a little too far. He wasn't just reading anymore. He was trespassing into territory darkness didn't want him to enter. The more he searched, the more resistance he felt. And yet, buried in those pages were clues. C.S. Lewis had seen this. He had walked this line between seen and unseen, and he had left breadcrumbs behind. But not just for anyone, for those willing to keep going when the fear sets in. Thomas was now walking straight into that fear, but he wasn't alone. Something was walking with him. Thomas couldn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound outside made him flinch. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was presence. Something was near, hovering just outside his awareness, waiting for the right moment. The book stayed open beside him on the nightstand, pages marked, scribbled with desperate notes. His eyes kept going back to one phrase Lewis repeated in different ways. Demons are weakened when you return to your center, when you remember who you truly are. But Thomas didn't feel centered. He felt unraveled. And still, something inside him, call it instinct, maybe even faith, refused to let go. He started doing the things the book hinted at, simple things, speaking truth aloud when the lies came, sitting in silence, even when the silence pressed back, writing down every thought that made him feel weak, and then rewriting it with what he knew was real. Slowly, the room began to shift, not in a dramatic way, but like the atmosphere was thinning, like something dark was being pushed back, inch by inch. Then came the night when it all nearly broke. Thomas had just finished writing in his journal when the air in the room dropped suddenly, icy, still. He looked up and saw the figure again, not in his dream, not in his imagination, standing right there in the far corner, tall, unmoving, cloaked in shadow, no face, but a presence so heavy it crushed the air from Thomas's chest. His first instinct was fear, run, hide. But another thought came quickly, clear and powerful. Demons hate when you speak light into the dark. His hand trembled, but he stood, and just as he opened his mouth to speak, the lights cut out, and everything went silent, except for the deep, cold breath behind him. Thomas froze. That breath, it wasn't his. It was too loud, too close, and it carried a cold that cut through his spine like ice water. He dared not turn around. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. But even louder was the thought racing through his mind. This is it, the real moment of testing. What you do next. They hate it. In the pitch black, his hand moved slowly, blindly toward the desk. His fingers found the edge of the book. Lewis's words came back to him again, like echoes across time. Demons fear those who know their true authority. They feed on confusion, but flee from clarity. With a shaky breath, Thomas whispered one simple truth into the darkness. I am not yours to torment. Silence. But then, the laugh. Low, mocking, almost human. A sound that didn't belong in the natural world. And in that laugh, something changed. The floor beneath him shook, just slightly, and the air turned sharp. He felt pushed, cornered, as if the presence wanted him to believe this wasn't just a visit. It was claiming territory. The tension broke something loose inside him. Fear no longer had control. Not completely. Not this time. Then the second twist came. From outside his window he heard footsteps. Fast, urgent, getting closer. A knock at the door, 3 times, hard. Thomas froze again. Who would be here now? It was nearly 2 a.m. He stepped toward the door cautiously, still feeling the presence hovering behind him as if torn between 2 forces. When he opened the door, there stood Jason, his friend from work, pale, sweating, eyes wide. "Thomas," Jason gasped, "I need to talk to you. Now you're not the only one this is happening to." Thomas blinked. "What are you talking about?" Jason looked over Thomas's shoulder into the dark room behind him and whispered, "I've seen it too, and I think it followed me." And in that moment, the air inside the apartment shifted again. He wasn't just being haunted, he was being hunted. And now, he wasn't the only one. Thomas stepped aside, and Jason rushed into the apartment without waiting to be invited. He was shaking, glancing at every shadow, as if expecting something to leap from the dark. Thomas quickly shut the door behind him. The moment the lock clicked, the cold air pressed in tighter. Whatever was in the room had not left. It was waiting. Jason turned to him, eyes filled with something beyond fear. "It's not just your place," he said. "It started with me a few weeks ago, the same stuff, cold rooms, things watching me. But last night, something touched me." Thomas stared at him, the weight of it all crashing down like a wave. This wasn't isolated. This was spreading. And suddenly, the truth in Lewis's words hit even harder. Evil often works quietly, not to scare, but to slip in unnoticed, spreading through the cracks of spiritual neglect. This wasn't just about fear. It was about territory, influence, control. Jason's voice dropped to a whisper. "I found something. An old prayer, One Lewis used. I don't know how, but it showed up on a forum buried in some theology archive. I've been saying it every night, but it only made the attacks worse. Thomas moved toward the center of the room, where the cold was thickest. That's because they want you quiet, not resisting. They hate it when we fight back. Then, without thinking, he began to speak, not just words from the book, but words from his heart. Truth, identity, light. Jason joined him, and as they spoke together, something cracked in the room. The light above flickered on just for a moment. The pressure dropped. The shadow in the corner wavered, as if losing its shape. A loud crash echoed through the apartment, then silence. It was gone. Jason collapsed onto the couch, gasping for breath. Thomas sat beside him, heart racing. For the first time in days, the air felt clear, peaceful. The presence had lifted. It was over, or so they thought. As Jason stood to leave, he reached into his coat and pulled out something small, a slip of old paper. "I found this outside your door before I knocked," he said, handing it to Thomas. It was a torn page from the screw-tape letters. But the handwriting on the back wasn't Lewis's, it was Thomas's, written in ink he didn't remember using. Thomas stared at the torn page in his hand, his eyes tracing over the familiar letters. It was definitely his handwriting, but the message was foreign. It read, "You knew this path before it began. Remember why you were chosen to see." His heart pounded. He hadn't written those words, not that he could remember, but something about them felt true, as if they were reaching from a deeper part of him, a part that had always known this battle was coming. Jason looked just as shaken, but calm in a strange way, like something had lifted from him too. They sat in silence for a while, letting the stillness settle in. Outside, the city continued as normal. Cars passed, people walked by. The world hadn't changed, but something in them had. The darkness had been real, but so had the light, and that quiet, persistent truth was what carried them through. Over the next few weeks, Thomas began rebuilding, not just his routines, but his inner foundation. He made space each day for silence, not to escape, but to listen. He picked up his Bible again, not out of fear, but hunger. The whispers had faded, and the shadows no longer stretched the way they used to. Jason did the same. They kept each other grounded, checking in, sharing what they learned. Their friendship deepened, not because of what they had survived, but because of how they chose to respond afterward. One thing became clear. This spiritual battle wasn't just about one night or one experience. It was about the ongoing, often unnoticed war for attention, for peace, for truth. C.S. Lewis had understood that, and he'd left behind a map, not a dramatic one, but a quiet one. A map of habits, of awareness, of resistance that worked in simple ways demons couldn't stand. In the end, it wasn't a ritual or secret spell that saved them. It was clarity, truth, and the courage to face the unseen. Thomas never figured out exactly how that note appeared or what force had written it, but he no longer needed to. He knew the battle wasn't about fear, it was about remembering who he was and who stood with him, and that made all the difference.